States of America and the Clinton administration, professor at Berkeley University, author of a brilliant new book, Aftershock, The Next Economy and America's Future. Robert Reich on the line with us. Robert Reich, reich.org is his website. Robert Reich, welcome back to our program.
Hi, Tom. How are you doing?
I am very well, thank you, and I hope you are the same.
I'm doing great.
I was so impressed by your suggesting that we should raise the tax rates on the super rich. I've, as you may know, written 2 books suggesting that we should roll back the Reagan tax cuts, and that in fact that might bring stability back to our economy. Not to mention, paying for things. But it seems like everybody on the right and the left, both parties, are afraid to even take on this topic. And you've not only taken it on, but you've done a really good job of talking back to the people who say you're crazy. Let's go through the details of this. First of all, what's your proposal?
Well, it's to reduce taxes on the middle class, Tom. Anybody who is earning under $50,000 should have 0 taxes. In fact, actually, a wage subsidy along the lines of the Earned Income Tax Credit. Anybody who's earning between $50,000 and about $120,000 should have a tax cut, dramatic tax cut. I mean, maybe 10% instead of what it is now for many of these people, which is 25 to 30%. And on up, I would reduce taxes on everybody up to $250,000, but then I'd reverse course. If you're earning over $250,000 to $500,000, your tax ought to be 40%, which is not all that different from what it was under the Bill Clinton administration. But then if you're earning $500,000 up to $5 million, I would say let's raise your taxes further to 50%. And then if you're earning, in terms of earnings, over $5 million, let's raise it to 60%. If you're earning over $15 million, if you're one of the highest rollers in America, it ought to be 70%. Now, this is not crazy in terms of our history, because between 1947 and 1980, the lowest tax we had on highest earners in this country was about 70%. Under Dwight Eisenhower, the marginal income tax on the highest earners was 91%. I'm just suggesting we go back to those days, and incidentally, in those days, the economy was growing much faster than it's been growing over the last 3 decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I've told the story on this program before of a business I ran in the 70s where my income was reaching the point where I was pushing a 50% tax bracket. My CPA said, why don't you just leave the money in the business? And I did. And we grew the business, and we hired more people. And it seems like that piece of the puzzle, the average American has been completely bamboozled about. That when tax rates on wealthy people or entrepreneurs who happen to have very, very good years, when those tax rates are really low, they suck the money out of the business and go gamble with it or stash it in a Swiss bank. When those tax rates are fairly high, they say, I think I'll keep the money in the business.
Of course. That's what we saw for those 3 decades after the Second World War. The other thing that Americans have been bamboozled about, particularly by Republicans, is this notion that if you cut the tax rates on the rich, somehow good things will trickle down to everybody else. But in fact, since Ronald Reagan took the tax rate down from 70% to 28%, the median wage in this country, the typical wage of average working people, has actually stagnated. Adjusted for inflation, it's gone absolutely nowhere. The median wage actually declined between 2001 and 2007, before the Great Depression. The Great Recession, I should say. It has been a depression. So there's nothing to trickle-down economics at all. And now, especially, Tom, when we've got such a huge amount of the nation's income and wealth at the top, and we have a budget deficit, and we have, middle class and working class people desperately needing social services that are being cut because of budget crises at the federal and state level. This is the time we ought to be thinking creatively. We ought to be saying, well, wait a minute, why don't we go back to what we used to do in the 1950s and 60s? Why don't we go back to what we did under Republican President Dwight Eisenhower?
Or Richard Nixon.
Very rich to pay their fair share.
Yeah, or even under Richard Nixon.
Or even under Richard Nixon, exactly.
It's like, and he wasn't all that opposed to it. Eisenhower was actually in favor of it.
So, when the Republicans in Congress went to Eisenhower and said, we ought to reduce the top income rate from 91% down, Eisenhower said no.
Mm-hmm. Oh, in the famous letter to his brother Edgar, as I recall, where he referred to the basically, I think, Granddaddy Coke, the Texas oil billionaires. He said their number is small and they are stupid. They wanted to mostly privatize Social Security at that time. You point out that since the mid-'70s, or in the mid-'70s, the top 1% of Americans got about 9% of total income. By 2007, they were getting 23.5% of income. I've heard numbers as high as half of all income in the United States going to the top 1%, or is that the top 5%?
That's probably the top 5 to 10%. No, by 2007, that is the top 1% were taking home almost a quarter of all income. The last time in our history we saw anything like that at all, where the top 1% was taking home over 23% of total income, was back in 1928. And interestingly, if you compare 1928 to 2007, you see that something quite dramatic happened in the following year. In 1929, we had the Great Crash. In 2008, we had a crash. It wasn't the Great Crash, but certainly Wall Street and much of the rest of the economy went down the tubes. And you have to ask yourself, well, is there a relationship? I think there is.
Yeah, well, and Larry Beinhardt was the first guy to point this out that I knew of, that if you look over the last 90 years, 80, 90 years, every time those top marginal tax rates have dropped, you have seen a bubble economy appear and a series of crashes happen, and as soon as the tax rates go back up, the bubble economy disappears. And it's basic.
And there are two things that are going on, Tom. The bubble is created because people at the top have so much money and are accumulating so much money, they don't have any place to put their assets except they speculate.
Right.
And that drives stock prices up into a bubble. It drives property prices up into a bubble. It drives gold and a lot of other assets and commodities up into a bubble. The other thing that happens is when average working people don't have very much money, when you're basically taking all the money and putting it at the top of the income ladder, most people don't have the purchasing power to turn around and keep the economy going.
Now, I have not heard a single Democrat suggest that we should. I mean, they're having a hard time getting the words past their teeth of roll back the Clinton, or the Bush tax cuts, going back to the Clinton rates of 39% on millionaires and billionaires. I'm hearing nothing from anybody about rolling back the Reagan tax cuts and going to a 74% rate on millionaires and billionaires, which is essentially what you're talking about. In the minute before the break here, how do we wake up the Democratic Party in a way that isn't suicidal? They think it is.
Well, I think Democrats have to understand that if they say zero taxes, income taxes for people under $50,000, and dramatic reductions for people under $250,000, that's going to attract a lot of votes. And the way you pay for that is you raise the marginal income taxes at the top that will also, incidentally, deal with your budget deficit problem. I mean, right now, Democrats are trapped by Republicans. They've fallen into the trap, which is that you can't preserve middle-class programs, you can't preserve working people's programs in the federal budget. You've got to raise taxes or you've got to cut those programs out. Well, that's just silly. We're the richest country in the world. We are still as rich as we ever were.
We're just speaking with former Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, professor at the University of California, Berkeley, author of Aftershock, The Next Economy and America's Future, Robert Reich. His website, robertreich, REICH.org. Worth checking out. Absolutely worth checking out. Read his piece, Taxing the Super Rich, Social Security, Obama Budget, Why We Should Raise Taxes on the Super Rich and Lower Them on the Middle Class. We'll be right back with more with Dr. Robert Reich.